Hi, I'm Josh Cohen, and I want to thank you so much for this incredible opportunity to talk to this seminar on John Rawls at the Iranian Society of Political Sciences. I wish I could be there with you in person, but I'm in Shanghai at the time of the meeting, and still I thought it would be best to send a video rather than a written paper, more like being there in person. So, that said, let me get started. So in spring 1974, I was 22 years old and a first-year graduate student in the Harvard Philosophy Department. And one of my courses that term was a seminar on Kant's moral philosophy with John Rawls. The class met on Wednesdays, and one Wednesday evening, after returning home from a meeting of the seminar, I had a phone call from John Rawls. He was calling, he said, because he was concerned about how the seminar had gone that day. I told him it had gone just fine. I thought that it was great, but I didn't want to embarrass him by being too enthusiastic. Now, I was pleased to get the call. When you're 22, it's nice to have your judgment taken seriously by somebody you hold in very, very high regard. But Jack didn't call to be nice. He called because he really wanted to know whether the seminar had been okay. He seemed genuinely worried about whether he had been understood, and I was a little surprised by his concern. But as I got to know him better over the subsequent 25 years, I found that intense worry was really very typical. I came to think that his deep concerns about being understood were based ultimately on his sense of the profound importance of his subject matter and his deep sense of personal responsibility to his topic. And that topic was morality, both personal and political morality. It was as if he thought there was something really bad, maybe nothing worse than failing to do justice to that important subject matter. And why was it so important? I think the best way to answer that question is to sketch the main ideas in Rawls's work. So in his book, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, Rawls proposed a striking and original marriage of liberty and equality, animated by a tolerant and democratic faith in human possibilities. For much of the previous century, the idea of a political philosophy devoted to both liberty and equality had seemed to many people a contradiction in terms. You had egalitarians who were outraged by vast differences between the lives of rich and poor, and they would condemn the liberalisms of John Locke and Adam Smith for giving too much attention to legal rights and liberties while remaining indifferent to the fate of ordinary people. Traditional liberalism, these egalitarians complained, prized equality before the law, but showed a kind of complacency in the face of profound and grim inequalities of fortune on earth. Classical liberals, in contrast, embraced personal liberty, and they criticized egalitarians for what they saw as a kind of paternalism and willingness to sacrifice human freedom in the name of some possible future utopia. Now, as a practical matter, democratic welfare states had tried with more or less success to ensure personal and political liberties while protecting individuals from unforgiving markets. But philosophically, the alternative seems starkly opposed. You had Friedrich von Hayek's classical liberalism on the one side and Karl Marx's egalitarianism on the other side, and everything in between was a kind of unstable political compromise or some ad hoc balancing of competing values. A theory of justice pointed to a different possibility. Rawls proposed a conception of justice, he called it justice as fairness, that was committed to both the individual rights that we associate with liberalism and to an egalitarian ideal of fair distribution that we associate with the socialist and radical democratic traditions. Justice as fairness, Rawls said, aims to effect a reconciliation of liberty and equality. Now, that proposed reconciliation of liberty and equality is crystallized in Rawls's two principles of justice. The first principle is called the principle of equal basic liberties. And this principle says that each citizen has a right to the most extensive system of equal basic personal and political liberties that's compatible with a similar system of liberties for others. This first principle of equal basic liberties covers both the liberties of the ancients, the political liberties of the ancients, and the personal liberties of the moderns. It requires stringent protections for freedom of thought and conscience, rights to participate in politics, freedom of association, freedom of speech, and the rights associated with due process of law. These liberties, Rawls said, have a special priority, and they're not to be restricted in the name of the community's overall good. This first principle, equal basic liberties, also includes a demanding norm of political equality, which condemns inequalities in opportunities for political influence. The idea is that citizens with the motivation and the ability to play an active political role shouldn't be disadvantaged by a lack of personal wealth. So that's the first principle, equal basic liberties. Rawls's second principle has two components. It restricts the extent of social and economic inequalities. The first part of this second principle, which requires fair equality of opportunity, says that jobs and positions of responsibility, which often carry unequal rewards, need to be open to everyone under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. And what that means, fair equality of opportunity, is that people who are equally talented and equally motivated have to have equal chances to attain socially desirable positions, regardless of the social class or their social class origins. Access to well-compensated, rewarding, meaningful work shouldn't depend on the circumstances in which people happen to have been raised. Where you start out in life shouldn't determine where you end up in life. So that's the first part of the second principle, fair equality of opportunity. But Rawls points out that even a society that achieves fair equality of opportunity might still have troubling economic inequalities. Say, for example, that some people, maybe because of some natural talent they have a scarce ability that commands very high returns in the market. Maybe other people don't have those scarce talents. Assume people in both of these groups work hard. They play by the rules. They contribute as best they can. Still, they will reap substantially different rewards. And those differences will have a large impact on their lives. The problem is that these inequalities of reward are founded in part on what Rawls calls natural contingencies, about how people have fared in life's lottery. And why, Rawls asks, should some people fare better than others simply because of the accidents of natural endowment? Here's what he says: there is no more reason to permit the distribution of income and wealth to be settled by the distribution of natural assets than by historical and social fortune. So to address this concern, Rawls proposes the second part of his second principle. Remember, the first part was fair equality of opportunity. The second part is the difference principle. The difference principle requires that we maximize expectations for the least advantaged social group. So what this principle says is that we limit the extent to which some people are economically better off than others simply because they happen to have been born with some scarce talent, say the hand-eye coordination of a great surgeon or an unusual mathematical gift. The difference principle doesn't require flat equality. Surgeon might legitimately be paid more than a teacher because a higher income compensates for expensive training or education. And inequalities might also be used as incentives to encourage people to take on jobs that they're really good at, but they might otherwise be unwilling to do. But what justice commands is that those inequalities work to the greatest benefit of people who are least well off. Now, Rawls's large point in this second principle of justice, both fair equality and the difference principle, is that we should reject the idea that our economic system is a race or talent contest designed to reward the well-born, the swift, and the gifted. Instead, our economic life should be one part of a fair system of social cooperation designed to ensure a reasonable life for everybody. In justice as fairness, Rawls says, men agree to share one another's fate. In designing institutions, they undertake to avail themselves of the accidents of nature and social circumstance only when doing so is for the common benefit. So we have two principles, equal basic liberties in that second principle with fair equality in the difference principle. And to defend these principles, Rawls returns to the idea of the social contract associated with Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant. The social contract idea is that the right way to organize a society is the way that the members of the society would themselves agree to in some initial situation. So building on this idea, Rawls asks us to imagine ourselves in a hypothetical situation. He calls it the original position. And in that original position, we're going to select the principles of justice that will be used in our own society. And now he designs this initial situation, this original position, to reflect the moral idea that we are free and equal moral persons, that we have the capacity to cooperate with others on fair terms, that we have the ability to choose our own goals and devotions, that we are able to pursue the ends that we set for ourselves. So he designs it to reflect the idea that the characteristics that distinguish among us are not really relevant to deciding on what we are entitled to as a matter of justice. We're to imagine, he says, our choice of principles of justice is taking place behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. A veil of ignorance where we don't know the irrelevant facts that distinguish among us, the facts about different people's social classes, their native endowments, their sex, their race, their religion, their moral convictions, and then reasoning from behind that veil of ignorance. What we do is we put aside what distinguishes us from one another, and we focus only on what we share as free and equal moral persons. Now, Rawls argues that in the original position, people would choose his two principles, and you can see why intuitively. Because imagine you have to choose principles for your society under conditions of extreme ignorance. So you don't know where you're going to end up. You could end up anywhere, but you got to live with the choice that you make. So what you want is to be sure that the society is going to be acceptable to each person. Now, after all, you could land anywhere. And his idea is that his two principles provide this assurance. They ensure that the social arrangements are acceptable to all members of a society of equals, both because the guarantees of equal liberties and fair opportunity to each person, and because of the assurances that each person has of an acceptable level of resources, even if they end up in the worst position, because the worst position is as good as it can be. So a theory of justice argues that justice as fairness, those two principles of justice, is the most reasonable account of justice for any society that thinks of its members as free and equal moral persons. Now, in the 1970s and 1980s, Rawls's proposed reconciliation of liberty and equality came under criticism from two sides. Libertarian political philosophers opposed his egalitarianism, and communitarians opposed his liberalism. The most forceful libertarian critique came from Robert Nozick in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Nozick there presented a philosophical defense of a very limited government, what he called a night watchman state, confined to protecting property rights and to protecting persons from aggression. Nozick's fundamental philosophical idea was that individuals own themselves and they're entitled to all the rewards they can reap from their interactions with others. Correspondingly, he said, egalitarianism, which he opposed, is ultimately founded on the morally repugnant idea that people are partial owners of one another. On the other side, from the communitarian side, philosophers like Michael Walzer and Michael Santel shared some of Rawls's egalitarianism, but they argued that a coherent egalitarianism needs to be founded on the idea of individuals as members of a community, bound together by deep solidarities and shared values. The redistributive principles of egalitarianism would otherwise strike people as arbitrary burdens, with some people being forced to serve others. But that solidaristic conception, the communitarians argued, was at war with Rawls's more individualistic idea of individuals as autonomous choosers bound together by a social compact. Moreover, they said, Rawls's picture was incoherent, and promoting it would threaten the bonds of community by giving excessive attention to individual rights of expression and association. In short, libertarians and communitarians both rejected the reconciliation of liberty and equality, of liberalism and egalitarianism that Rawls proposed in his conception of justice as fairness. Now, Rawls reflected deeply on these criticisms, and he found that in the course of those reflections, he found that he needed to engage more deeply with issues of religious, moral, and philosophical pluralism. And those reflections culminated in his 1993 book called Political Liberalism. What Rawls realized was that liberalism can be thought of in two fundamentally different ways. First, we can think of liberalism as an overarching philosophy of life, what Rawls called a comprehensive doctrine, an encompassing moral and metaphysical outlook. Or, second, we can think of liberalism more specifically as a philosophy of politics. The first way, the idea of liberalism as a philosophy of life, emphasizes the importance of autonomous personal choice as a guide to individual conduct. Moral liberals like Immanuel Kant or John Stuart Mill or more recently Ronald Dworkin argue that the unchosen life is not worth leading, and they downplay the importance of tradition, authority, and religious text in judging how best to live. In contrast, liberalism as a political outlook makes no such sweeping claims about the proper basis of personal decisions. Liberalism as a political outlook is committed to securing basic personal and political liberties through a democratic process and a system of individual rights, to providing a decent range of opportunities for individuals, and to ensuring that individuals have an adequate level of resources for making use of their liberties and opportunities. But citizens with very different views, very different comprehensive philosophical views about the importance of choice and tradition and authority and text, might all reasonably embrace that political framework. Rawls was especially concerned about disagreement between secular moral liberals who endorsed a Kantian or Millian or Aristotelian idea about how to live, and people who embrace religiously based ideas about the right way to live. And he came to think that a theory of justice had connected liberalism as a philosophy of politics, what he called political liberalism, that it had connected that political liberalism too closely to liberalism as an overarching comprehensive philosophy of life. By tying them so closely, what he had suggested was that only moral liberals, only people who embrace liberalism as an overarching philosophy of life, could also be political liberals. But that, he came to understand, is wrong and also a serious problem, considering the powerful presence within democratic societies of religious citizens who reject the comprehensive philosophical liberalism, who affirm, as he put it, a religious doctrine that's based on religious authority, for example, the church or the Bible. That's a quote from him. Those religious citizens, he understood, might also endorse a liberal political philosophy, defined by an emphasis on personal freedom, religious tolerance, open inquiry, the rule of law, a leveling of traditional social hierarchies, and democratic politics. This is what he says. Rather than confronting religious and non-liberal doctrines with a comprehensive liberal philosophical doctrine, Rawls thought we should instead, here's the quote, formulate a liberal political conception that those non-liberal doctrines might endorse. So he substantially revised the presentation of justice as fairness in order to show that it could be endorsed by a wide range of citizens as a shared public basis of political argument. The aspiration of political liberalism was to show that liberalism as a political framework, a political doctrine, is a deeply tolerant outlook capable of being embraced by adherents of very different philosophies of life, both secular and religious. A political outlook that could provide a shared public reason that citizens in a pluralistic democracy with opposing moral and religious views could use as a common basis for political discussion. Now, Rawls later extended his reflections on justice to the global level. He then imagines a global society composed of different peoples with different values and traditions and ideas of justice. Once more, to arrive at standards of justice now for global society, he draws on the idea of an initial compact. But the principles that ought to govern the society of peoples, what he calls the law of peoples, are not the object of a global compact among free and equal individuals. Instead, they are agreed to by distinct peoples. In describing the terms of the compact that issue from the law of peoples, toleration once more plays a central role. Rawls argues that a liberal democratic society shouldn't be requiring that all societies become liberal democracies and fully satisfy the principles of a liberal conception of justice or endorse its idea of individuals as free and equal moral persons. This is what he says. If all societies were required to be liberal, then the idea of political liberalism would fail to express due toleration for other acceptable ways of ordering society. The law of peoples, he argues, instead ought to acknowledge as members in equal standing all decent peoples, those that are not aggressive in their relations with other peoples, that respect human rights, and that promote the common good of their members. But these peoples need not establish liberal democratic political systems. And in addition to insisting that all societies protect basic human rights, the law of peoples also imposes a duty on peoples to ensure that societies that are burdened by circumstance, extreme poverty, for example, are able to become just or at least decent. Now, a lot of Rawls's critics expressed disappointment with his law of peoples. Global justice, they said, should require more of societies than that they achieve an acceptable minimum of decency. They found in the law of peoples a disappointing concession to cultural relativism. But Rawls disagreed. Toleration, he argued, is a fundamental political value. Because it is, the basic principles of global cooperation need to be acceptable to different peoples who have distinct institutions and languages, distinct religions and cultures, as well as different histories, and who don't all share a liberal understanding of political life. In acknowledging a range of reasonable differences and freeing the law of peoples from too close a connection to political liberalism, we're not embracing relativism or conceding anything. Instead, we're keeping faith with a deep ethical conviction about the importance of toleration. Now, for reasons of political temperament and intellectual conviction about the role of philosophy in a democracy, Rawls rarely pronounced in public on specific policy or political issues. He did condemn the American system of election finance, which he regarded as violating the equal standing of citizens in the public forum. He also strongly criticized President Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he expressed a preference for achieving economic justice through what he called a property-owning democracy, with large investments in education and training and widely dispersed ownership of productive assets, rather than through a conventional welfare state, which relies on the redistribution of market income. But John Rawls's distinctive contribution lies not in his policy recommendations, but in his political philosophy, a contribution that is both abstract and also deeply practical. There always will be an Aristophanes or a Machiavelli in our midst to complain that philosophers have their heads up in the clouds or buried in the sand, to deny people who deny the practical importance of philosophical abstractions about justice. So be it. By upholding ethical ideals, showing that they are reasonable and achievable, political philosophy stands on the side of hope and struggles against cynicism disguised as political realism. I visited John Rawls in the hospital in fall 1995 after reading a draft of his introduction to the paperback edition of Political Liberalism. He had suffered the first of several strokes. And our conversation on that visit focused on a passage in which Rawls says, quote, "Debates about general philosophical questions cannot be the daily stuff of politics, but that does not make these questions without significance, since what we think their answers are will shape the underlying attitudes of the public culture and the conduct of politics. If we take for granted as common knowledge that a just and well-ordered society is impossible, then the quality and tone of those discussions will reflect that knowledge. A cause of the fall of Weimar's constitutional regime was that none of the traditional elites of Germany supported its constitution or were willing to cooperate to make it work. They no longer believed a decent liberal parliamentary regime to be possible. Its time had passed. President Hindenburg was finally persuaded to turn to Hitler, who had popular support and whom conservatives thought they could control. To avoid the great horrors of political life, like Nazism, Rawls thought, political values, ideas of justice, need to be a settled part of the public culture, presupposed, he says, and operating in the background. Losing grip on those values is not realism, it's the beginning of calamity. And this is where philosophy enters. Its role is to articulate principles of political morality, defend them from the cynicism of realists, so-called realists, cynics, hope that they take hold in the background culture, and show that that hope is reasonable. This work is of great importance. Rawls was right that the stakes are large, and he was right to be anxious about whether he was making himself understood. I hope for all our sakes that he is better understood. Thanks very much. Very grateful for this opportunity. Wish I could be there and hope I can get there next time. Thank you.